Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon session. My name is Yiorgos Mylonadis. I'm on the faculty at London Business School. I'm a reformed economist by training, so I managed to move away from economics, unlike my two colleagues here who are still in economics. And I teach strategy and entrepreneurship. I am a reloader as well. I think I'm number 7 on the volunteer list on Reloader. You know, like you say, number 3 in Facebook, number 2 in Google. I'm number 7 on Reload. My task today is actually very simple. My task is to introduce two people who play an important role in different spheres of life, and allow them to make some comments, and then open up a conversation with them. And our objective is to open it up to the audience for lots of Q&A. So first of all, let me say a word about our speakers. George Houpis, who is right here. There are 3 Georges here. I'm Yiorgos, he's George, and he's George. George Houpis here. George finished the same school of economics that I finished in Athens a few years after I did. That should chronologically place him. And he went to London School of Economics, where he got his master's and PhD. And then after that, he has spent all his professional life practicing as an economist. He's a partner at Frontier Economics, where he advises companies and regulators on issues that have to do with telecommunications industry. He is the chairman of the board of Reload Greece, and he has played a very important role in getting Reload to the place where it is today. He will open up with some comments, and then we'll hand it over to George Chouliarakis. George went to the same school in Athens that George and I went. He went after George. That should place him. He went to LSE as well. He got his master's there. Then he got his PhD at Warwick, and he went to start an academic career at Manchester University. However, he had to come back to Greece to serve his country in the role of chair of the Council of Economic Advisors to the current Prime Minister, and also as an alternate Minister of Finance, representing Greece in the very important negotiations with the institutions. So please join me in welcoming both of these people here. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Very good. Thanks, Yiorgos, for the introduction and your kind words, and so subtly showing what my age is. That's very much appreciated. What George forgot to mention is that the company I work for is a consultancy, and unfortunately for you, consultants cannot really deliver messages without slides. So you'll have to bear with me. I have prepared some slides for my presentation. And what I'd like to do today is actually comment on the Greek growth strategy plan, which has been published in July of this year, a couple of months ago. And the main experience that I'd like to bring on that is, as Yiorgos mentioned, my experience as a professional economist from outside Greece, all my professional life, although I have worked in Greece as well during this period, and also my experience in the last 3 or 4 years, my involvement with Reload. Now,
Takes a while.
right. So I will come back to the reason for the title to my presentation a little bit later. But where I would like to start from is thinking about the question of the growth strategy is, first question you have to ask yourself, where is growth going to come from? Yeah, that's a key question. And I think there's broad consensus here, probably amongst a wide range of people, I would say that the levers that were available for driving growth after the post-war period in Greece, big government spending to start with in infrastructure, etc., followed by strengthening consumption with lending, are either no longer available as they were, or certainly they cannot be used to the same extent as they have been used in the past. And what that leaves, those of you that are economists amongst us would understand that government spending, consumption, and exports is the third element of GDP or income, is how can you drive growth through the promotion and the growth of exports. And when I say exports, what I mean is any kind of activity which implies you generating increased value added beyond the buying power of the Greeks in Greece. Okay, I would like to interpret it a little bit more widely than just the statistical definition. Now, the truth is the government itself, there will be a few Greek statements, but what I'm interested in is the numbers in the Greek statements. So hopefully, if you can't quite follow, please ask somebody next to you. I'm sure they can translate for you. The aim of the government is actually, it's an explicit target stated in the growth plan to take exports from around 30% of GDP to 50% of GDP over the next 5 or 6 years. Okay? To give you a bit of a sense, this is quite a big increase. So currently it's around 60 billion. You're talking about adding another 20, 30 billion in terms of exports. And what I've done is to show you in clusters the ratios of GDP to exports for effectively the main European countries. I don't think it would be worth going beyond that. You can see Greece is in a cluster with Italy, France, and Spain at the lower end, which I would call the 30s cluster. Next to that is what I would term the 40s cluster, and that includes the Scandis. And also Portugal is in there. And then you move to the right, you start getting the bigger performance. You have countries like Germany getting close to 50%, and then Central and Eastern European countries. Now, what that tells us, I think, is that you can get to 50%, because there are a number of countries that have actually got there, and those countries are not necessarily very far from Greece. There are countries that are close to Greece. But when you think about the business model to get there, I think that is a more challenging question, because we know that Greece is not Germany. I don't think you need me to tell you that. And then when you think about Central and Eastern European countries, for those countries, they've had a lot of direct investment, which then has strengthened the manufacturing, exporting it back to the rest of Europe. And also Central and Eastern European countries had the flexibility of the exchange rate, which I don't believe that Greece certainly hasn't had it historically, and I don't think it will necessarily have it in the future. So a key question is, the target is very welcome. We think this is the right approach, the right target. The question is, but how do you get there? All right? So let me then go back to my the question of my first slide. Why is Nokia finished? Now, to be honest with you, the way I have tended to ask this question, because as George said, I worked in telecoms all my life. The way I have tended to ask this question is not why is the company Finnish or French or Irish, it's why is it not Greek? But I'll stick here to actually trying to answer the question specifically about Finland. But before I do that, to give you a little bit of history, I suspect people know Nokia, even though the trends have moved on and it's no longer the big power that it was in terms of handsets. This was the reason it became famous. And it's what I would call the Mercedes of handsets. And now I am showing my age. I didn't need George to introduce me. So the history of the company is quite interesting. It started in the 19th century as a pulp manufacturer, take trees and produce paper, which is not surprising given it was Finnish. What happened then in the 19th century, they moved from pulp manufacturing into other types of heavy manufacturing, rubber and the like. And then after the war, they moved into more sophisticated electrical engineering, and maybe some of you might remember Nokia televisions. And in the 80s and the 90s, they then moved into the mobile industry with the handsets, and then they had the tremendous success that they had. Okay? So what I've tried to do is to think, going a step back, let's think of this in terms of entrepreneurship, and let's try and think what has been, it's not a coincidence. Nokia is not a coincidence, and I'm going to try and show you in a moment why. But think in terms of inputs and outputs, how would you think about the country that has produced Nokia? So the first thing I've done is to look a little bit at one index, and then there are many. This is called the ease of doing business index, and it covers a number of different measures. How is it to set up a business? How easy is it to close a business? How is it to find property? How is it to get the licenses, etc.? And this is a global rank. So just in case any of you are getting excited, the lower you are, the better you are. Okay? So as you can tell, Estonia and Finland are doing very well on that index. And of course, there are measures. I think you need to interpret these things carefully. There are measures where actually Greece is doing well. You can't quite see it in the aggregate measures. There are other measures that they're doing less well. But I think what you can do is that, what you can see is that those countries have performed extremely well, Estonia and Finland. And also, I've put a few of the other countries that I mentioned earlier in terms of export performance. If I now then move to say, okay, this is the input for entrepreneurship. What's the output? How do you measure the output for entrepreneurship? Then what I've done is I've looked at the patent applications per 1,000 POP, i.e. scaling the number of patent applications to the size of the population of a country. And to be honest, this is not an area that I've done a lot of research myself, but I was surprised myself when I looked at these numbers. So Finland has the highest number of patent applications for the last 7 years. Highest number of patent applications than Germany. And if you actually add up, you can do it visually. France, Italy, and the UK, they're less than Finland. Right? This is a country, half the population of Greece. So you might say, okay, that was in the last few years, but actually you can also look at the history, and of course there's a big effect from the growth of mobile and Nokia. You can see that. But it started, it's the orange line, Finland, it started already at a high level when in the early 90s. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm sure if I ask the question, how many of you have Nokias today in the audience, my expectation is that I'm not sure even any hands are going up? No, not a single one. Okay, so I think the question then is, is Nokia finished now with one N? And what we've seen actually is that still today, it was bought in 2014 by Microsoft, the mobile part, and still today it employs around 110,000 people. I mean, in last year, 110,000 people. Obviously not all of them in Finland, but 100,000 people. And then the other thing we have seen is what I would call a spillover effect. And obviously, a lot of people have left Nokia, but that has created a very strong spillover effect in Finland in terms of tech and new enterprises. And what you have seen is that, especially, for example, in gaming, the growth and the emergence of a number of companies are very strong in this area, including one of my children, and actually myself. So Angry Birds is actually owned by Rovio, and Rovio is a Finnish company. And there are others as well like that. So what does that all mean for Greece? Sorry. Right. Three observations in terms of the Greek strategic plan. First of all, when we read it, you won't be surprised to find out, the first thing I did was to try and count how many times the word entrepreneurship appears in the plan. And it's not that difficult to do. So it appears 31 times. Okay? It's a big document, but still 31 times. So there is a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurship in the Greek growth plan. And the key area that I think the plan rightly emphasizes is what we would call horizontal measures. It's the sort of things I was mentioning earlier, i.e. how easy it is to set up businesses, how easy is it to then wrap them up, etc. We think this is the right emphasis. And to bring a little bit of our experience in terms of the ventures that we have seen go through Reload, what I've done is to put on the chart the classification of the sectors of the 100 ventures that have passed through Reload the last 3 or 4 years. And what you can see is at the bottom are the sectors where Greece is traditionally quite strong. Okay, so there's quite a few from there. But also look at the top, how many more we have in terms of other sectors and have had in terms of other sectors. And I think this is really important because when you think about one of the objectives of the plan, which is to increase value added, a lot of this value added would come from ventures like this. Now, if I move on, another plan which is particularly interesting for entrepreneurship and for ourselves, another element of the plan is how much money goes into R&D. And Greece historically and traditionally has been quite a low performer of that in terms of the money that goes to R&D as a percentage of GDP. The plan again here has measures about money going to help research. And excuse me, these are quite substantial amounts. I've just put one example here. It's 394 million euro to support 685 research projects. But then, what the plan does is it says there is a system that's being set up which will monitor the outputs from that. Monitor. But we haven't seen any targets. There are no targets on that, despite the fact that, as I said earlier, there is an export target. So what we think could be done is to actually consider more how you would make sure that this money gets translated from going into research. How does that go into ventures, new ideas? And then how do you go then from new ideas, which is my first metric, and then how do you go from new ideas into businesses and viable businesses? And here, I've looked at the numbers of businesses that have been created in Greece versus other countries. It will hopefully come up. But what you will see is the number of companies. I only had the data for 2016. And again, you have to be very careful because you can't compare Greece in 2016 with a number of the other economies. But you will see that I think there is still quite a lot of a gap to be closed if we want to generate the number of businesses in Greece than we see in other countries. And I'm not talking about the likes of Estonia and Denmark. But even if you go to Portugal, Portugal in 2016 created 6 times the number of businesses that we did. Let me close with some comments on the brain drain. It's as close as I will go today to anything that is political. I'm going to try to stay out of that. But we have seen in the last few months discussion about brain drain and this becoming a bit of a political issue in the sense of trying to get people to go back to Greece being a sign of success. Now, we don't agree with that. We don't like the term drain. You can tell that, I think, from the title of the slide. We prefer something else. But I think we know that economic migration follows economic prosperity. We know that. All you have to do is look at all the thousands of people that passed by Greece to go to Northern Europe over the last few years. So we don't think that this should really be a criterion of success and then become some sort of, if you want, an important element for political debate, because that will happen. The key thing is, for us, how do you take advantage of the brain that exists outside Greece now, and it's likely to exist for years to come, in order to generate better ideas in Greece? That's the way we like to think about the brain that exists outside Greece. And we think if you actually look at the diagnosis of the plan that in terms of the issue with Greek entrepreneurship, we would agree with that. The plan itself says it's a relatively low intensity knowledge. And we think the Greek brains that exist outside Greece can make a great contribution to generate ideas that are both scalable, innovative and value-adding, as I said to you earlier, and also with global ambition, which we think is very important. And maybe in 5-10 years' time, somebody will sit up, who sits here in the audience, somebody will sit up here and have a presentation which would say, explain to this audience or the next audience why Nokia is Greek. Thank you very much.
You want to?
Sorry,
I won't be having slides, so it's okay. You can leave them. No? So thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here among so many talented and creative young people. It's in many ways refreshing and mind-opening, and a very nice break from daily business in a continuous, if you like, crisis management mode. So I thought hard about how best to address the audience, and finally decided to give you a few comments on how fiscal policy, which is the area where I'm in charge of, the area I overlook, and that is the budget and the debt, how fiscal policy can be designed to facilitate wealth creation. In a way, my comments are complementary to George's comments, in that fiscal policy on one hand, the medium-term fiscal strategy, and the growth strategy on the other, are the two pillars of economic policy making going forward over the next 4 years. You may disagree about the content, but if you want to think conceptually about how economic policy is made, you have to put flesh in these two pillars. So I can get back to George's comments later and have a dialogue, but I thought it's also important to put some flesh on the pillar the pillar that is closer to my heart, if you like. So to do this, to think about fiscal policy, I think one has to, how fiscal policy affects wealth creation, one has to consider fiscal policy making in a concrete context, in a historical context. And we have to think about the last 3 years and the years that are to come, the next 3 or 4 years. Consider the dilemmas and the trade-offs that policymakers face in real time. And when you set policy in real time, you do it under conditions of uncertainty, in some cases extreme uncertainty. And also, I have to explain the set of feasible policy options, taking into account, of course, the constraints and the priorities one has. So what I want to do basically is to narrate you the constraint optimization problem that a policymaker is facing in real time. When we think about fiscal policy, when people think about fiscal policy, they usually think about the dull task of setting the budget, of setting public expenditure, tax revenues, managing the cash flow, managing the debt payments of a country in a way that is efficient. And there is a lot of truth into this. This is part of the job. It is actually a very important part of the job. But to my mind, and from my experience, fiscal policy is also to a large extent, if not primarily, an exercise in shaping people's expectations, steering expectations about the near term and the medium term outlook of the economy. And I think this is where most of the action has come from over the last 3 years. And I'm saying it because people's expectations about the outlook of the economy for several years, definitely since 2010, have been extremely pessimistic, and there is a deeply rooted, embedded perception from the public, and this includes households, firms, and markets, that the Greek state cannot balance its books. It's not unfair. It's not an unfair perception. For many years, the Greek state was suffering from what one would call a deficit bias, able to generate deficits, but unable to tidy up public finances when times were good. And therefore, there was a deep conviction that the risk of default, and therefore the risk of exiting the euro, was real and quite high. And this perception affects behavior. Behavior adjusts accordingly, household behavior, firm behavior, economic activity slows down. In some occasions, just like in Greece between 2010 and 2014, the economy tanks. So one of the key tasks of the policymaker, of the fiscal policymaker, is to steer expectations in another direction, in a more positive, if you like, direction. And the way to do it is by restoring fiscal policy credibility. The way to do it is by showing that the state can deliver on its commitments, can meet primary fiscal targets, and in some cases even overshoot them, so as to create positive expectations. But more on this in a little while. What I want you to take away is that one of the key policy objectives there is to reverse pessimistic expectations about the outlook of the economy, therefore reduce uncertainty, if not remove uncertainty altogether, stabilize the economy, and create an economic environment within which business can thrive and the economy can grow. So this is one way that fiscal policy can indirectly affect wealth creation and economic activity. Second way is by affecting the liquidity conditions of the economy, again through credibility. The cost of borrowing for the Republic can fall, and then lower borrowing costs for firms follow as well. Households feel far more comfortable to deposit again their money in banks. Banks' balance sheets become healthier. They can lend money again, and so on. And finally, the third key way through which fiscal policy can affect wealth creation is by changing the tax structure in a more growth-friendly direction. Is what we call the change the fiscal policy mix. Now, taxes are always and everywhere distortionary. They reduce incentives to supply labor and save. This is all well known. But they are also important. And they are important because it's important to provide and finance public goods. It's important for dealing with externalities. It's important for redistribution. The key question there is how do you strike a balance between all these competing objectives? So can a policymaker simultaneously meet these key policy objectives, restoring credibility on one hand, striking an optimal tax structure on the other, dealing with public goods, externalities, redistribution? From my experience in public service, I would say it's highly unlikely. And to a large extent, fiscal policy is nothing else than an exercise in trade-offs. You have to sacrifice something in order to achieve something else. So when I took office as interim Minister of Minister of Finance and then alternate Minister of Finance in charge of fiscal policy, the set of policy tools that I had available were extremely limited. That also applies to my predecessors and ministers of finance since 2010. There is no monetary policy autonomy. There is no room for exchange rate policy. Greece is part of a currency union. There was no fiscal firepower, no fiscal room. Greece was excluded from the markets. Banks were extremely fragile. You know, you can't think of a more limited set of policy tools. But also my diagnosis was that the root of the problem was the lack of confidence towards fiscal policy institutions and overall lack of confidence towards public policy institutions in Greece. Therefore, priority should be given to restoring credibility. And again, I define credibility as the ability to deliver on your commitments in fiscal policy. This means meeting your targets. We took a decision to do this in a more in the most diligent way possible, overshoot the targets if needed, create positive surprises, send out a clear signal that Greece has turned page as far as public finances go, and I think we achieved it. And the measure of success is the significant drop in the government bond yield over the last 3 years. It was 8% in January 2015. It was 11% in July 2015, and it now hovers about 4%, still high, but considerably lower, and there is room to fall further. But achieving this key objective, I think it was key for the country. I think it was very important for the country to go back in the map of credible fiscal policy making. We had to sacrifice, it came at a cost, if you like, of very high taxes all across the board. Personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, consumption taxes, and so on. So now that this key policy objective has been achieved, and of course it has to be maintained, and it has to be safeguarded going forward, the new priority, and this is the priority that is actually reflected in the draft budget we submitted Monday this week, the new priority is to gradually start changing the fiscal policy mix in a more growth-friendly direction. There is a significant first step in this direction in 2019. Corporate income taxes will be lower by 1% per year between 2019 and 2022. Dividends taxes will fall by 5%, proportionally by 33%. And personal income taxes will follow through from 2020 onwards. But I know this is not enough, and we are eager to hear ideas on how tax policy can facilitate new business, can facilitate the conversion of new ideas to wealth creation. It's something you are actually engaging with and engaging with successfully. So it's important to hear from you, important to take into account what one will call low-hanging fruits, small tax changes that can have a big impact on your business and on wealth creation. But wealth creation also needs a stable and efficient business environment. I'm now moving away from fiscal policy to the second pillar, the growth strategy. And despite the ambitions of the growth strategy, there is still plenty of work to be done there. To be fair, there has been a lot of reforms implemented over the past 8 years, and over the past 3 years in particular on product market reforms. But there is still a lot of work to be done, especially on 3 areas. And these are licensing, how easy it is to open up and close a business, justice, in public administration. And I think the focus of the growth strategy is around these three reforms. Now, the best way to do it, and I think we will have the chance to talk about it in a while, is to set explicit, measurable targets. One obvious target is improving your relative standing in the league tables of the World Bank, and go for it, and assess how well you do per year, and improve when you fall short of the target. But again, is an area that needs more fleshing out than we have done at the moment. And again, an area that I'm eager to hear what you think and what your views are. Maybe I should stop here. Yes. And happy to engage with questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. Let me start by actually explaining what this session is about. I intentionally left this to the later part because I wanted to see what my colleagues would exactly present, and also because I think their presentation speaks for itself. So let me start by opening up with a couple of questions. I'll start with George, yourself, in the second part of your discussion. So you started by talking about fiscal policy and how the tax structure can sometimes be geared to benefit entrepreneurs. But you've ended by talking about the business environment more broadly, and you talked about justice, education, and so on. But let me start with the last thing that you said, which is setting targets. Now, I noticed when I looked at the growth plan, it's 108 pages. The first 14 pages are about kind of fiscal sustainability. And in that first part, there are lots of targets, right? Lots of targets. When I look at the rest of it, which is this business-friendly environment that you talked about, there are very few targets. So the first question I have for you is kind of almost like an education question for us, which is, why are there these targets there? I presume they are because of the very difficult negotiations that you had with institutions. If that's true, were these targets beneficial, you think, in the charting of this fiscal stability? So that's my kind of a basic understanding question to learn from your experience.
I'm glad to hear that the fiscal part is the part with more well-defined targets.
There's numerical targets, lots of them, very explicit.
Well, it's all about incentive structures, I think. Setting targets, explicit and objectively verifiable targets is a way to motivate you to complete the work. Mm-hmm. Pretty much like in a university essay or a dissertation and so on, to complete the work and deliver. And also let the public assess whether indeed you do what you're saying you're doing. So it has a second round effect of basically enhancing your credibility and make your qualities visible and public, if you like. I think the incentive structure argument is the primary primary reason for having quantitative targets. It's also a very useful tool for you as a yardstick to know how other countries have done, what other countries are doing while you improve, and therefore position yourself accordingly.
Yeah. So then if we go to the other, 97 pages or something, which are these important areas of creating a favorable business environment, there, targets are, there are very few actual numerical targets to strive for. Now, as you mentioned, there are lots of international indices. There are indices for social justice, for governance, for welfare, for skills, for competitiveness, for ease of doing business, and the list goes on. And these are not, there's no choice in the growth plan about which of those indices would be good indices for the strategy to be compared against. So I would say, if we leave the growth plan behind us for a moment and we just think about the future and dream of dream of us being here 5 years from now, having another conversation with a new growth plan in front of us, where these targets have been set, have been selected, and have been set. What do you think will transpire between today and the day that that will happen? Who would be the hero of the story who would have helped make that a reality? So who is will it be some business person, or will it be an educator or a religious figure or an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist or a politician, a parliamentarian, a magician? Who would be what would that person look like that would bring about such change from what we have now, where we would need to go?
Well,
I'll start with you, George, and then...
Give the minister some time.
Yes.
So I think I sort of preempted this with my presentation. I don't think it's a question of foreseeing exactly where the new and good ideas are going to come from. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit my belief. I think you have to create the right environment. I totally believe in targets, because, and probably even more so for Greece, because without those targets, then it's extremely difficult to judge success. And back to the minister's point about incentives, it's unclear to me that the incentives of the policymakers are necessarily to meet targets. I mean, there might be good incentives in terms of achieving input targets. We spend the money. A lot of discussion, as a number of people will know, when it comes to European programs and funding from the European Union, is around how much, the term absorption is used. How much money have you actually been able to absorb, et cetera. But much less so in terms of output. So for me, the most important thing would be to go back to my presentation. What is the degree of business generation? How many new ideas we see? How big are the new businesses that get generated? And I'm very relaxed about who would be the person that would kind of take the credit for achieving this. But to my mind, it's about creating the conditions to see the kind of growth we've seen in Finland, which I totally understand. Greece won't become Finland in the next 5 years, but it's creating the conditions to give the country a chance to get there.
Let me press a bit more on, actually, before we go to George. I think the reason we're having this session is because Reload has soldiered on for many years, believing that entrepreneurs can do it, right? We don't need the government. We don't care about those conditions. As long as there's will, there will be a way. And I think the reason we're having this conversation is because we realize that while that is true, and many of the people in the morning said that, you do need the conditions around the entrepreneur to enable that growth. So I think the answer you're giving me is, some people are going to do it. But the question I'm asking is, unless we create that environment, it will be very hard to do. So who can be the hero that creates that environment in terms of setting targets for making sure Greece ranks, 30 places better than where it currently ranks on ease of doing business? Who is the agent who will make that happen? Is it the minister? Is it the chair of Reload Greece? Is it academics? Is it someone who's sitting here in the audience? What will that person look like, or that process look like?
Let me
yes,
pass it
I'll pass it on.
So a couple of points. First of all, one thing is to improve your standing in a league table, which is important. Another thing is to sustain a good standing in the league table. If you look around the globe, there are several countries who've managed to play the game and improve their relative standing, only to find themselves slipping behind again 3 or 4 years later, because the reforms that were legislated and initially implemented lost steam. So implementation and sustaining a good relative standing is all about the environment within which business operate. And the environment is complex. It has a particular political economy. It's about politics. We shouldn't minimize or undermine the role policymakers play and will have to play in the future. But it is also a matter of pressure, a matter of fertilizing the governments with new ideas. They are not always at the cutting edge of ideas and innovation, and they need input. So it's a complex system of equations. It's not just one thing. And I want to emphasize this bit. It's not about improving. It's about sustaining your relative standing, and then the political economy of policymaking is the key, I think.
Excellent.
The only I think I would add from our own experience is that I do think there is a positive spillover effect from having good examples of people that succeed. And Greece entrepreneurs in Greek, there are good examples that have succeeded in creating ideas and then making them international. And how to take those and turn them into a culture, spreading the message, changing a little bit the mentality of the Greeks and how Greeks see entrepreneurs is also quite critical. Some of this is government related, and obviously you need a government that supports that, but I also think it's related to a wide...
I did promise that we're going to open it up, and I see a notice that says 2 minutes, so let's take 2 questions.
Minutes.
Hi, I want to ask about fiscal. So my name is Dimitris Bitsos. I've been here 12 years. First of all, I want to thank you for your service. I'm a big fan. You assumed office in 2015, a country with a big recession. And here we are a month ago on a country that is growing. After conducting financial tightening, fiscal tightening, now we have current account surplus. We are meeting the targets. The government yields went from 11% to...
What's the question?
Right, the question is, you talked about pessimism and credibility. Right now, around us, Italy and the emerging markets are having a bad time. How are you actually restoring credibility with the current budget when, you know, you don't want to cut the pensions, and instead of that, use it to boost growth, because the countermeasures are to boost growth, like tax reductions and spend it on education? So that's one question. Because
yeah. Thank you. Let's take one more question. At the very back.
Hello, George Economidis. Thank you for the presentation. Very quick question. Very welcoming the news about the tax cut and the dividend. However, this mainly apply to large companies. Here we are talking a lot about entrepreneurship, small startups that would not be profitable in the first few years, and there is a lot of a very low taxable limit. How would you especially target helping the SMEs?
Okay. Can we take one more? Can you answer this? Sure.
Hi, my name is Haris Nikitakis. A question for Mr. Chouliarakis. Given the perception of bureaucracy and how difficult it is for one to set up a business in Greece, could you give us some examples of specific measures that the government has taken to address this and make Greece more friendly towards entrepreneurs?
Thank you very much. George, over to you.
So thank you for your kind words. I'm not used to kind words from the audience. I'm usually used to getting the stick, which is okay. So a very quick answer to the question. We have already met. Credibility is about meeting your, keeping your word, basically. It's about convincing the public that what you're saying you're doing. That's all. And we've met our primary fiscal targets, the medium-term ones, already 2 years ago, 2017, 2018, we are already up at 3.54%. So I think that there is now little doubt that we will be able to maintain the target. Actually, a sign of success is that we now have the space that is the fiscal firepower above the target to do things that we couldn't be doing before. Tax cuts, primarily tax cuts. This is what we prioritize. But you have to you want to redistribute, and it's good to redistribute. But first, you have to improve the fiscal policy mix in a growth-friendly direction. You need to lower taxes, and that's what we're doing in this budget. Social security contributions will be lower for free professionals, for the self-employed, for the young, so that they put their foot in the job market ladder as quickly as possible. Corporate taxes, dividends taxes, and so on. I take the point of the second question. I think it's a fair point. Reducing CIT and taxes on dividends does not necessarily help new business, startups, and so on. Maybe lowering social security contributions for the self-employed will. But as I said before, I'm not an expert. And my visit here is, as I said, a mind-opening visit. I'm eager to hear what you think can cost little and can have a big impact on the way you do business. That's important. So it's an invitation for you to tell me rather than for me to instruct. The third question, so there is, again, my answer has to be short. There is 1 million of very small reforms all across the board, especially financial markets, product markets, and public administration that we have legislated and now we're implementing. I can very briefly refer to the 3 toolkit boxes of the OECD, hundreds of small reforms that break down barriers to entry and open up professions, for example, as good examples of how you improve your business. Am I happy? Am I satisfied? Do I think we've done it? No, we're far away, but it's the right direction. Can I finish with one point on targets and how important it is to be able to measure your successes and your failures? In the Ministry of Finance, we are now gradually shifting towards what we call performance budgeting, where we don't just monitor the inputs we commit to certain services, but we also try to quantify the outputs. How much of output and what kind of quality you produce for every euro you actually spend. And we're now working, we have a pilot working with 3 ministries, trying to quantify services, try to monitor whether they meet targets and so on. It's still early days, but hopefully in a few years' time, the budget will be based on performance criteria rather than on inputs.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.